you saw the transition from armed struggle to civil disobedience had, I think, at its root, this new body of leadership, civil society leadership, youth leadership, of people wanting to be principled in relation to their dissent, of people being frayed and fatigued by what had gone on, of people also looking to make atonement between their own communities, within their own communities, between their own communities and themselves. And you saw a different commitment emerge, saying that some of the ways in which Kashmiris have talked about the armed resistance there is that that was necessary for us to be taken seriously. But now we are in a different phase where we want non-violence to be at the center of it, and various people that are actually extremely critical of violence, that want non-violence to be the way in which they approach their resolution. You saw all of that happen. You saw mosques, for example, be used to, historically to store grains, and then in modern times, as you said, in the Idgah, for spaces of dissent, for spaces of people coming together to think. But at the same time, the class divisions in society and the ideological divisions in society and the capitulation of privileged classes to the government of India, or to the government of India's just concern with creating a collaborator class, concern with creating a coterie that act in its own interest. That's been, I think, quite intense for the movement to contend with. And again, when I say the movement, there isn't a coherent singular movement. It's various fragments struggling to think together. There's one more thing. There's also the role of just neoliberal capital. If you recall, in Srinagar, the airport, the shops, even malls that are coming up, there is the understanding that through integrating development into the lives of the people, we can bypass sort of people being in the streets to what the future needs to be, and we can bypass the tougher questions through perhaps an infusion of capital and market economy in Kashmir.
Why was there no attention paid to that huge nonviolent demonstration at the Idgah in Srinagar in the international press?
I think two things. I think crisis in the international press is sort of, the soup of the day. Are you in? Are you out? And maybe you're not in today. But I also think part of the reason that it was not taken seriously is because the Kashmir issue is still one between India and Pakistan. In the international imaginary, it is something between India and Pakistan. It's not something where the Kashmiri people really feature. And the Kashmiri people feature when something sensational happens. And when something sensational happens, that ironically conforms to this stereotype in the international imaginary, and thanks to Islamophobia, that stereotype post 9/11 is of Muslims being violent. So there are various things that happen that are non-violent, that are principled, that are profuse and beautiful in Kashmir, that escape attention in the international press.
Do you see any parallel between the way the Indian state responds to any criticism about Kashmir and the way China responds to any criticism about Tibet?
Yes, absolutely. I think that, and there's another parallel which makes me, reflective as I think about it, that look what happened in Tibet. Tibet today, the majority in Tibet are not Tibetans. The ways in which dissent was silenced, the ways in which people were assimilated, those tactics are also being deployed by the Indian state vis-à-vis Kashmir.
One of the central tropes of the Indian state's justification for its actions and ongoing occupation in Kashmir is the plight of the Hindu pundits, that is to say the indigenous Hindu community in Kashmir, which numbered in the several hundred thousands. How has that evolved, and how has the Indian government been so successful in using that as a kind of cudgel to silence dissent about Kashmir?
Kashmiri pundits and various minority groups in Kashmir, a lot of them have been displaced, over about 200,000 people. And Kashmiri pundits of Hindu descent, between 209 and I think a very high figure of about 765, have been killed. Kashmiri pundits, and I've spoken to many of them, that are group civil society leaders there, that are actually working in collaboration with their Muslim counterparts for a peaceful conflict resolution in Kashmir. One of the things that I've understood through talking to them is that the Indian state has precisely attempted also to nationalize Kashmiri pundits who understand themselves to be Kashmiris far before they understand themselves to be anything else, and to use that to divide them in relation to Kashmiri Muslims and Kashmiri Muslim demand for self-determination as precisely a strategy to have religion remain central to this issue. And you have in Delhi and actually in the diaspora, even in the United States, various and very problematic and irresponsible groups around the Kashmiri Pandit issue talk about this, where the facts are extremely distorted, where what has happened is extremely distorted, where the response of the Indian state is actually not acknowledged in terms of what the Indian state has done vis-a-vis Kashmiri Pandits, and where the voices of Kashmiri Pandit scholars, Kashmiri Pandit leaders who are actually pointing to this issue that, look, don't divide us from Kashmiri Muslims. Look, we need to live here. We want to live here. We haven't left. One of the things these leaders keep telling me, and scholars, Kashmiri Pandits in Kashmir, is that why is it that people don't ask us what we think? You're always asking the Pandits that have left, that are perhaps aligned with the Indian state, ask us what we think and what is necessary to move forward, and how bridging the divide between Kashmiri Muslims and Kashmiri Pandits is critical to this issue.
Given the level of opposition to Indian rule in Kashmir, what keeps the Indian state there? I mean, obviously there's a huge price to pay in this occupation force. Is it, as has been suggested, water resources? Is it hydroelectric power? Or is it just the idea, as you suggest in your essay, that Kashmir represents India's coming of age as a power?
I think all of those things. I think India's coming of age as a power is also its ability to prove itself militaristically. That's how colonial powers function, right? And the post-colony, sadly, has been too quick to emulate the colonizer. I think that it's certainly geostrategic. There's China, there's Pakistan, there's Kashmir. Kashmir is the buffer between New Delhi and China and Pakistan and Afghanistan. So geostrategically, it is a very, very important location. Ecologically and in terms of economic resources and water resources, we are well aware that one of the crises or wars, if you will, of the 21st century will be around water wars. And the glacier, controlling it, Siachen Glacier, and controlling it is extremely important to India's national interest. Then there is also sort of revisionist history and the nationalism of Kashmir being central as the figurehead or the headspring of India that it needs to control. So I think it's geostrategic, therefore political, it's militaristic, it's economic, and it's nationalistic.
What about the other components of the state? Jammu, which is Hindu majority, and Leh, which is primarily a couple 100,000 people, Buddhist majority.
Yes, Ladakh, yes. I think that there has been some conversation about civil society leaders from Kashmir wanting to approach people in Jammu and people in Ladakh, especially in Ladakh, where it's been quite problematically vitiated, the relationship between Buddhists in Ladakh and Muslims in Kashmir. To make amends, to restore, to heal, to sit together, to think together. And that, I think, will be extremely important. The undertaking of that will be extremely important to the future of Kashmir. I also think that Jammu is a hotbed of Hindu nationalists, historically has been and continues to be. And Jammu, therefore, is quite complicated in terms of its own relation to Kashmir, its own relation to the nation. So I think Ladakh is different. Ladakh and Kashmir and their relationship, Jammu and Kashmir and their relationship, they are very much influenced by the histories that these places have lived, and therefore the ideological movements that today occupy them.
In your essay, The Militarized Zone, you write, a culture of grief hangs like a shroud over Kashmir. What is it like to live in a place where you're under constant surveillance or you face the threat of being stopped, of being searched? Just even the possibility of that must exact a huge psychological toll on the population. You've been in and out of Kashmir multiple times doing your research. What is it like there for the people living in that situation?
I've been there now since July of 2006, 16 times. That's a lot of times. And I think one of the things that comes to my mind, and this is a very visual image, you know, a limestone wall, and if you claw your fingers through it, you know how the limestone gets in between your nails and you can't get it out. Yes? It's like that. In between your nails, under your skin, grief, suffocation, claustrophobia, and a certain amazing beauty and pride and richness of culture. That on the one hand, and the futility, just supposed futility, in which when I talk to people, how do you remain here and what is it like? And before I even say what they say, just to go in and out of it is hard. Just to go in and out of it, just sort of what it has done to my own life is hard. I cannot imagine what it is for Atta Muhammad. I cannot imagine what it is for my colleagues. And I think the best solidarity as a citizen of India, as someone of Hindu descent, that I can offer them is to not forget. I cannot forget. I'm sorry, is to not forget, not forget, but is to not forget. I cannot forget. I think what they tell me is that limestone under your nails, how you live with it is by playing with it, by taking it seriously, by not giving up on it, by not pretending it isn't there. Because one of the things we tend to do when we're traumatized is either only live in the trauma or pretend that the trauma isn't there, not to actually befriend the trauma. And to befriend the trauma requires seasoned, multiple ways of addressing what your life is. But to address what your life is requires that you address the saturation of Kashmiri society, polity, economy, environment, psyche with the reality of militarized governance. That, I think, is what my friends and the people that I have collected testimonies from, hundreds and hundreds of them, that is what they tell me. They tell me that, every other home in Kashmir has a history of suffering. Every other square is witness to sacrifice, to rape, to torture, to death, to enforced disappearances, and suppression as weapons of war. And within that, how you choose to live is the decision you take that keeps you somewhere in between the livable and the unbearable.